the reason we always come back to the two-state solution is there really isn't an alternative other than an Israeli state that is no longer Jewish, or an Israeli state that is operating an apartheid system that occupies the West Bank, that occupies Gaza. So it's because the alternatives are so bad that you hold on to this hope.
Well, let's now speak with Sir William Patey. Sir William's the former British ambassador to several countries in the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia and Iraq. Sir William, welcome to the show.
Hello there.
How are you feeling about today's events?
Well, it's good news. It's certainly long-awaited news. The families of the hostages will, be elated. The Palestinians who've suffered for 15 months of bombardment and starvation and displacement, they'll be feeling a lot better today. And if the aid gets in, then their position will improve. So it's a good day all round. A long time in coming. This deal was first mooted in May last year. So there's been a lot of killing and destruction in the meantime that could have been avoided.
And talk to us a bit about the wider regional and international diplomacy on this. Of course, America has had a huge role to play, and many argue that it is the coming of Donald Trump that has kind of expedited things. But talk to us as well about some of those big regional players like Qatar and Egypt.
Well, it's a new start. I mean, Qatar and Egypt and the Americans were all critical in bringing us to this position of a ceasefire and the possibility of a prolonged ceasefire and an end to this particular conflict. But it's set in a wider context with the weakening of Hezbollah in Lebanon and a new government in Lebanon, the fall of Assad, and the strategic loss that Iran has faced. This all provides an opportunity, and Donald Trump coming into the White House, I imagine he will want to pursue the next phase of the Abraham Accords, in which Arab governments made peace with Israel, normalization with Israel. He'll want to extend that to Saudi Arabia. And that in itself opens up the possibility of the beginning of a peace process towards a two-state solution. But there's a long way to go because Israelis feel insecure. And I wouldn't think there's a majority within Israel for a two-state solution at the moment. And indeed, the state of the Palestinians, they wouldn't be able to run a state. But, it does offer the hope of the beginning of something new.
And it's interesting you just say that. One of our listeners, David's just messaged in saying, hi Aisha, no chance of a two-state solution in the next 20 years. If ever, too much mistrust, too many complicated challenges and irresolvable conundrums. How does a functional state exist with separate land in the West Bank and Gaza? Not even all the West Bank now. And what will happen to Jerusalem? Sir William, do you want to sort of have a go at answering David's question?
Yeah, I mean, David's right. It's a long, long way away, and there's not going to be a two-state solution anytime soon. But you do need to get to a position because my question is, what's the alternative? And the reason we always come back to the two-state solution is there really isn't an alternative other than an Israeli state that is no longer Jewish, or an Israeli state that is operating an apartheid system that occupies the West Bank, that occupies Gaza. So it's because the alternatives are so bad that you hold on to this hope. And it certainly needs a long process. It needs to be building up trust. It needs for the Palestinians to give up terrorism, armed struggle against the Israelis. It needs the Israelis to stop the settlements in the West Bank. And it needs the international community to come together to start rebuilding Gaza and rebuilding the West Bank. But you'd be a naive optimist if you thought a two-state solution was anytime soon.
And another question that's just been swirling through my mind, Sir William, is obviously right now this has been so in focus in our minds after those terrible attacks on the 7th of October over the last 15 months. But what we have seen in the past with the Middle East is, something bad happens. There is the beginning of a peace process, and then the kind of world loses interest a bit, and it kind of just leaves the situation. How do we make sure that the world stays engaged in this to make sure that we can try and get to phase 3 of this process?
Well, with great difficulty. I think we can get to phase 3 because that's a relatively short time span. But you're quite right to point out that in the past, when we've reached a sort of status quo everyone gets comfortable with it, and everyone forgets the Palestinians and forgets the issue, despite the fact that history teaches us that it will come back and bite us if we don't address it. So maybe we'll begin to learn the lessons of history, because we got to a position by October the 7th where nobody was talking about a Palestinian state. And you could argue that was part of the rationale behind that horrific Hamas attack. It was to break out of that complacency, which they've certainly done, at huge cost to Palestinians and a terrible price in trauma for Israel. But hopefully we can learn the lesson. But I'm not entirely sure we could. There is an opportunity here. I hope we don't squander it.
And what part can Britain play? Because it does feel that, as you say, the big players are, of course, America, and Trump is going to be really integral to this process. Egypt, Qatar, the Saudis as well. The regional players are very important. Turkey is very important as well. Where does Britain fit into all of this? Do we matter much in all of this?
Well, less than we did, but we still have a big historical responsibility. And we have a large Jewish community in Britain. And you usually find that British Jews often take a very sensible view about Israel and can be a force for good in trying to persuade Israelis that there is a future of living side by side with a Palestinian state. So Britain has a historical role. We still have a seat on the Security Council. We're respected by many of the Arab states who will be involved in the process. So we would be part of a wider international community, not the most important players by any means, but because of our historical role, we should be there as part of an international community supporting this process. And I think one of the things we could do would actually be recognize a Palestinian state, despite and when you get to negotiation, you have a Palestinian state negotiating with the Israeli state. Now, that seems quite radical to a lot of people, but I think it would help get the negotiations underway.
That's a really interesting idea. So, William, fascinating to speak with you. Thank you very much for your time. That's Sir William Patey, the former British ambassador to Saudi Arabia and Iraq.